Hello and welcome to my first C# tutorial series. In this series, we'll be getting started with C#, and I'll be showing the fundamentals of it and helping you getting started. Today's lesson isn't going to include much of creating anything as is explaining what you start with. So after creating your first C# project, specifically this is a console application for .NET Core, and you'll end up with this template. What we're going to do today is I'm going to show you how this works and give you a assignment afterwards that you can go do on your own to further your learning. Let's get started. So to start with, what we're starting with is, well, basically the hello world of C#. We have this window that pops up. This is a console window, and once all of the I forgot something. This will run and it won't give you a moment to see what actually happened. What we're starting with is basically this template, which is just the C# hello world. We're going to add one thing to it today. This is the only addition we're going to be doing to the code. And I'll explain what that does in a minute. We're going to go ahead and hit run. It's going to build, and we're going to get hello world on the screen. Now if we press any key on the keyboard, it will just disappear. That allows us to see what happens, and then we can exit the program by clicking a key. So let's figure out what we're actually doing here. So we're going to start at the top of the file, and it says using system. What does that mean? Alright, so in Visual Studio 2019, these blue words are called keywords. Keywords are special. They tell the compiler, I am special using, basically says, hey, I need this library or this namespace, which I usually don't have access to, but I really want to use here. In this case, system contains a whole bunch of cool, unique things that let us do things like console.writeLine and console.readKey. Now, you don't necessarily need to use anything in a program. You could, in theory, make a program without using anything, but it really does help when you're using a large amount of things in a given namespace. The system namespace contains a large amount of very important things that are used in a lot of applications. Mainly, they are used for things like getting I/O and just generally manipulating things and making them work. Next, we have namespace. What does namespace mean? Namespace basically says, put everything that is within these curly brackets into its own little folder. So when we say namespace lesson 1, we put everything into a namespace called lesson 1, and in another file we can use lesson 1. Now we don't have anything special or anything that we can really use at this moment, but we'll be getting into that in a later tutorial. Next, we have the class keyword. So what is a class? Well, a class is basically a container which you can reference and use and transfer between different points in your program. I'll get into more detail of what that is, but just keep that in mind in the future. The next keyword we have here is static. Static basically means, hey, as long as you can see me, you can use me. So you don't need to have an instance, we'll be getting into that later, of a class or a struct or anything to use this method, this class, or anything contained within it. So in this case, we have a static void. Alright, what does a void mean? A void is basically a type which returns nothing for methods. So when you have a method that needs to be called by something, but you don't want it to give anything back to you, you make it a void. Now, we'll be getting into different things for that use in a later tutorial. Next, we have this keyword, string. The best way I would describe a string is basically a whole bunch of letters put together. Now, there's probably a better, more advanced definition of this, but for the purpose of this tutorial, just know that it's basically a bunch of letters crammed together. And for our keywords, that's really it from this program. But now let's dive into a little bit more detail about each of these pieces. So using, it just brings something in so you can use it in this file. A namespace basically says, here's a label. If you want to use me, you need to use this label. A container of sorts for different functionality, variables, and just generally data and data manipulation. Now the static void main is special. It has what are called arguments. Now an argument is basically something you give to a method that allows it to have additional information while running that method. The main, so a static void main is basically a method called when your program starts, and it takes one argument. It takes the arguments that were passed in when running the program, and it turns it into the string array called args. You can change the name, but it's generally kept as args, considering arguments, short form args, fits it pretty perfectly. Now inside of this method, we have some different calls to different methods. Now, what we're doing here is we're basically saying, hey, we want to grab the console class from the system. So the system, we already said we're using it up here, so we don't need to do system.console.writeLine. So what console.writeLine does is it basically takes a string and it puts it into the console. So when we hit run here, you see it outputs hello world. Now what writeLine specifically does is it writes that string, and at the end of it, it puts what's called a Newline Character. Now a Newline Character, which is represented by \n, is basically a special character that says, hey, this is the end of the line, anything past here is a new line. There are other different special symbols, but we'll get into them in later tutorials. For now, just know that special characters can do special things, and you can use them to your advantage. Now console.readkey actually gives something back. What it gives is a console key information. You can see this highlighted here. As the description says, obtains the next character or function key pressed by the user. The pressed key is displayed in the console window. Okay, so what does that really mean? So basically what this does is it waits for you to press a key on your keyboard. Then, when a key is pressed, it returns a console key information. What a console key information is basically all the information relating to what key you pressed, if you're pressing Shift, Control, Fn, and Alt, and it will give it back as an instance of console key information. Now in this purpose, we're not using it to get the key, we use it to hold the program so we can actually read what's already been sent out by the console, and then we can tell it to continue by just pressing a key. This is really useful when you have programs where you need to read all of what the console output is before it closes. Some programs you don't need this and you can output to a file, but we'll get into that in later tutorials. Now that we've gone through the basics of this starter template, let's change it a little bit. So what we're going to do is, we're going to do a little bit of modification to this. Instead of saying hello world, what about hello C#? Alright, how do we do that? Quotation marks indicate a string. That's how you define a string. So we can find, hey, this is the hello world that's being printed. Let's change it to hello C#. That'll be it for lesson 1 of basics of C#. Now, your assignment for this video is to create a program which outputs 2 different lines that say 2 different things. Alright, best of luck. See you in the next tutorial.